for joining us as we go on. So let's kick off today's webinar. Good morning, my name is Dave Butler, CEO of the UKAA. Welcome to today's webinar. It's the fifth we've done this week, and this session is one I think particularly pertinent in a week that the government have announced a change in the rules on leasing and opening the business again for agents. Today's session is all about the key topic of winning the rental market in a post-COVID recession, hosted by Homemade, and will be led by Joe Green, Head of Business Development at Homemade, who's going to, you'll be seeing most of the time, who's going to introduce the panel. We have a very distinguished panel with us, but I'll let Joe talk about them and let them talk about themselves. But really, people cross all sectors in the residential market with lots of, I'm sure, really interesting things to say. So before we kick off, a few housekeeping rules, but I'm sure everybody's so familiar with Zoom by now that you probably don't need me to say them, but I will anyway. We have down the bottom of the screen the options for Q&A. We want to keep this session interactive, so please do submit questions to us. Joe will pick them out and address them to the panel. If there are questions that can't be answered live, then we'll pick them up and we'll respond to them as best we can. There is also a chat function if you want to say anything to anybody privately or to all of us. Hopefully nice things you want to say to us. And then finally, just to let you know, we're recording a session and it'll be available on the UKAA website in a few days' time for you to review, look at the highlights, and maybe look at the lessons we're going to learn today. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Joe. He'll take it away from here. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Good morning, everybody. And yeah, thanks especially to the panelists today, because it's turned out to be rather an unexpectedly busy week, so I'm grateful for your time. So just very quickly, introductions for those that don't know me. I'm Joe, Head of Business Development at Homemade. And Homemade are a prop tech lettings company specialising very much in build to rent, lease up and demand creation. So the panel, I'm pretty sure, are known to everybody, but just in case you don't, if you can just go through and do a quick intro, guys, that would be great. Thanks. Tracey.
Morning, thanks Joe. Yeah, Tracey Hartley. I am Head of Residential at London's Howard de Walden estate. We are build to rent in the form that we have a large portfolio of rental properties worth about £1.3 billion, all located in central London. Key difference is our stuff was kind of started to be built in around the 1700s.
I'll go next. Hi, thanks Joe. Thanks Tracey. So my name is Stephanie Smith. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of Operations for the European residential and student housing realm of Invesco. We currently have about 2,700 homes across, across Europe right now. And then we also have, those are across between 14 assets specifically in the UK, and then we have an additional 9 in mainland Europe, and about 70% of those are operational. And I am very pleased to say that in the midst of all of this, we were able to actually complete one of our sites last Friday as well, up in Salford. So really excited to see that one moving forward. And then we also do have another 5 student housing buildings that I help out with.
Thanks, Steph. And Matt?
Yeah, I'm Matt Stansfield, Lettings Manager at Get Living. For those of you that don't know Get Living, we own and manage circa 3,500 residential homes across the UK, split across 3 neighbourhoods, 2 in London and 1 up in Salford, just outside of Manchester. We look after about 6,000, 7,000 residents across the 3 sites. Looking forward to contributing to the panel today.
Excellent, thank you. So yeah, just to kind of frame what we're going to talk about, the purpose of the session really is to have a discussion around some of the key issues that the sector is going to face going forward, and then hopefully kind of pulling that all together maybe into an overview of how they can be addressed and sort of tackled as part of a winning strategy. So the kind of 4 buckets that I've put for us to discuss are market reaction, what's going to happen, and lessons that we can learn from past recessions, if any are comparable indeed. Investor priorities, what they are and now and what they might be in the future, and what changes there might be. Consumer behaviour changes due to obviously COVID, and then, as I say, putting it together in developing a winning strategy. So I'll kind of go through, I'll frame the discussion, and then if I throw it open to you guys, and you know, obviously get your valuable contributions there. So if we start with the market reaction, you know, it is inevitable. We face a recession. We know that. I think it's unclear what kind yet. I think V would be the optimum. I think that's what the optimists would like to see. But I think the longer it takes to go back, the less likely that is. So the ugly word, I suppose, to start with is arrears. You know, I think that's still playing itself out in the sector. I think, you know, the kind of impact of the loss of reduction of income is only really just hitting this month, potentially. And I know there's been some controversial figures reported, with collection rates being as low as 44%, but certainly the build to rent sector doesn't seem to be you know, bearing that out at all. The numbers reported so far are far more buoyant. I think Granger reported 94% yesterday. So it'd be interesting just to get your take, I think, on that, you know, first. You know, what do you think the best and worst case scenarios will be? You know, what do you expect sector-wide and perhaps in your own businesses? So if I can throw that at you first, Tracey.
Thanks, Jo. I think I'm sort of a natural optimist anyway, so I find it hard to dwell too much on what the worst case scenarios will be, but absolutely echo what you said there around collection rates have held up, and talking to peers across the sector, that seems to be the case. Obviously, you know, we look very different to commercial property, and I suspect we possibly look quite different to the more mainstream private rented sector, made up of buy-to-let landlords as well, and that could be partly down to just our processes as a sector in terms of better referencing of people to begin with. In terms of what kind of recession we're going to face, I'd need a crystal ball, but I don't see that, I really don't see that our rents are going to be massively impacted over a period of time. I can see potential reprofiling away from certain customer types. And for example, right now, we've got some exposure to overseas students. Well, I don't think they're coming back anytime soon. So we need to find a different audience for those types of properties. And that will take a little bit of time to work through. But in terms of collection of existing tenants, most people seem to be able to pay their rent. That could be down to the success of furloughing right now. And potentially when we see more redundancies coming through the system in the coming months, that might alter. But it's been surprisingly resilient up till now, and I'm going to keep upbeat and positive about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, you know, I think, as I say, the impact is, you know, still playing itself out, and you know, maybe we're not going to see the total impact for a while to come. But what's your take on it, Steph?
I have to say, much like Tracey, I'm a bit of an optimist myself. I mean, I've seen some pretty tough times in the US multifamily market and recognize the resiliency of residential, because there's always a need for homes, and especially as you look at you know, potentially home sales slowing down, things like that, as people are more frugal. I do think that we'll continue to see growth within ours. It may be slightly slowed. I know, for instance, we're predicting a U-curve across our entire European business for the recovery. However, we do think that ours in residential will be, because of the diversity within the portfolios, will be a bit closer and bounce back probably a little bit faster than some of the other markets that we work within. I have to agree on the student portion, because I know that our rebooking has slowed down exponentially. For instance, we have an asset over in Ireland, and because they've not announced yet when the courses are going to be starting, we do have several students who are still interested in coming back. However, they don't know when they're coming back, because they don't necessarily want to travel over from a different country and sit there in a room for a month. However, I am pleased to say that we do have several rebookers already, and we have done some creative thinking as far as flexible start dates and things like that, so we can capture the students that are interested in coming back already. I mean, I do think that we will see maybe a slightly slower up curve in the premium communities because there will be uncertainty. You know, there will be a bit of a what if around potentially a second wave of coronavirus coming in, and also those people who may have been furloughed before or just, you know, outright had their income impacted because maybe they were self-employed and couldn't qualify for the benefits package the government was putting together. You know, they will probably be a little bit more cautious potentially on taking that more aspirational property where they were stretching their income a little bit more. And I do think that there may be also a little bit more turnover within those communities. And so that's where we need to start being quite creative as far as offering transfer options, working with them on payment arrangements, and which we've already been doing across our sites. So we have very positively collected. Last month, we averaged 96% collections across our portfolio, which I think is a phenomenal number. As of Monday, we had one site that was actually already 98% collected, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. And then the other ones were starting to edge up between the upper 80s and mid 90s already. So, and then I am pleased to say that the remainder of those arrears that are in place right now are largely tied over actually to payment arrangements. Speaks volumes to our team's ability to connect with the residents and make sure they're staying ahead and communicating with them.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that has to be factored in, because I think obviously, you know, the furloughing packages, the government, you know, response, which has been, you know, hugely impactful, is sort of plugging the gap at the moment for a lot of people. So, you know, when we move further into the recession and you know, the impact perhaps turns to unemployment, and as furloughings pull back, you know, I think maybe there is going to be a lag effect on this. Maybe there'll be a delay, and you know, maybe the impact will be more broadly felt, you know, a bit further down the line. And I think, you know, maybe that has to be factored in as well. I don't know if you guys are planning for that, or, you know, if we're just kind of going on a sort of month-to-month basis at the minute. Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think just first of all to echo, you know, what Tracey and Stephanie have said in terms of, you know, the outlook. I think we can be exceptionally positive. And I think just picking up on what Tracey said around, you know, the steps that we all take as operators in terms of our diligence around, you know, ensuring that, you know, we are responsible to our residents, and we don't sort of set them up for tenancies that they can't, you know, they can't afford, I think is a really important point. I think in terms of the arrears picture, we probably, you know, we all want a crystal ball, right? But we, you know, we don't know what the future is going to look like. But I think we can be positive because, you know, we're not in the same situation, you know, that we were in 2008. You know, the government has taken some, you know, unprecedented measures to mitigate the impact. And whilst that unfortunately won't cover everybody, I think the damage is going to be limited. I think as operators, we've all got an opportunity here to kind of really come good on our, you know, on our commitment to change the rental market, you know, and to sort of set ourselves aside, you know, from the buy-to-let market by, you know, really taking care of our residents and offering them solutions, because housing, you know, whether you're in the premium or the lower end or in the middle, housing is so fundamental to people's ways of life. And I think we've got a real opportunity to kind of, you know, set ourselves apart from other parts of the market by offering people flexibility, giving people solutions that helps them get through what may well be difficult times ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's all good. It's good to see that everybody's positive. You know, it is what it is, and you know, as you say, only time will tell, really. So yeah, I mean, obviously that's one element of it, arrears. There are other elements that are inevitably going to come into play in the coming months. Increased supply is going to be one. There's been a very visible implosion of the short-let market, and a lot of those properties have now come to the market, you know, for long-term rental. I think buy-to-let landlords are inevitably going to become competitive. You know, they're able to react very quickly and drop prices, and that's arguably going to widen the gap between the build-to-rent proposition, and obviously those, you know, buy-to-let properties. So I suppose rather than it is, frame the question, is it inevitable that there's going to be an impact on pricing? You know, we know in the multifamily sector in the States, in the 2008 crash, rents declined by sort of between 5 to 8%. In London here, although build to rent wasn't in its kind of form as it is now, that London rents fell by up to sort of 9%. So will we see the same here, and how quickly, you know, how quickly and how deeply do you think it'll hit? I'll come to you on that one, Steph, first.
Sure. So first I need to borrow Tracey's crystal ball when she finds it. But I think to a degree, yes. You know, I think that, I don't know if I'd compare this as much to 2008 as I would to actually the impact after 9/11. And maybe it's the American in me, because I remember that quite vividly for many different reasons. But I think that this is probably a little bit longer of an impact disaster, so to speak. The US multifamily market really saw a massive shift in residents streamlining more. We saw a lot of people move from, you know, very high-end communities with 2 luxury cars down into maybe a smaller property within the same community, or potentially over to sister communities. Our cross-country transfer programs became very popular because we were able to help people and retain them within our management organizations. And then they became far more aware of that quality of life. So, you know, as Matt was saying, this is really our opportunity to show the strengths of build to rent. You know, there was also a huge influx after, well, between 9/11 and then also during the 2008 crash, where there were a lot of developers and owners who had huge plots of land that they had to do something with, otherwise they were going to be they were going to be penalized. Now, unfortunately, what we did see is that some developers decided that they were going to build commodity properties, very much so, fill them up, sell them off, and just kind of be done with it, but within the multifamily realm, as opposed to kind of the buy-to-let. Because of this, there was a huge push that all of a sudden they were just inundating the market with 3 and 4 month concessions. And to this day, that market has still never actually fully recovered. Even now, I have talking to peers, joining some of the different groups over with the National Apartment Association, and recently there was a webinar hosted with Kingsley and Grace Hill, where they were saying that instantly one of the first reactions was to put concessions out there, residents coming in and asking for concessions. So we have to be very careful with the way that we handle this. We know that buy-to-let landlords, because many of them, that is their stream of income completely, they probably will dump pricing. I think that we need to be careful how we angle any concessions that we do give, because realistically, especially in our luxury communities, we probably will give some. But I would really be careful about dumping your market rents, doing amortized concessions, because obviously that's also going to impact your valuations. And it sets up that preconceived notion that upon every renewal, they will start to still get that concession. I think this is also, it was also a time when tech really started to be used a lot more intelligently. You started seeing useful tech come out, and being more, I guess, well planned, if you will, because anytime a market starts to explode, you do have a lot of different tech, and sometimes it's for the sake of tech. And what we did see is that it was starting to be used more effectively. So where you needed to kind of maybe cut some overhead or maintain a steady overhead as far as payroll and different measures on the property, really thinking about how that's being used. You know, I mean, if you have 3 different apps and none of them talk to one another, none of them talk to your systems that you're using in the back office, you're creating more work and more overhead for your on-site staffs. And you know, that's very often one of our biggest causes of leakage. And a lot of people don't necessarily realize that, because it's really great to have the latest technology. But we need to think even more so now about our teams. And I mean, not to sound cliche, but we do need to communicate more. I mean, we really are all in this together, and we're the ones who are able to shape this market and make sure that it doesn't get kind of too insane. So I think that now is definitely not the time to hold secrets, if you will.
No, that's good. And yeah, it's interesting, and there's some, brings some really valuable insight in terms of what happened, stateside, and what we might see and hope we don't see happen over here. Just on pricing, Matt, what would be your take, and what sort of, I'm sure you're not going to share the Get Living strategy, but what can you bring in terms of what your thinking is?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate, isn't it? I suppose ultimately, price is going to be driven by the increased supply, which I think we've obviously seen with the short-lets market collapse recently. I think in terms of my view, I think more so now than ever, it's about what value for money do we give, and this is where the kind of the build to rent sector can really thrive, because we've kind of at Get Living, for example, we're looking at what value do we add to the whole experience. And I think in terms of if pricing does start to decrease, then you kind of have to ask yourself what kind of questions, what kind of things are people going to have to drop in terms of their proposition that might mean that the value decreases. So you're thinking things that Get Living, like the resident events, our on-site teams, our 24-hour support network. We still believe that they are key to our offering, and so pricing for us is more a combination of, yes, the market, but also the value that we add as well.
Yeah, sure. Tracey, anything different to add to that, or?
I think well, I agree with everything that's been said, but one thing that I think always stands out with the rental sector is it is counter-cyclical to house sales, and generally with the housing market, that in terms of the capital values takes a bit of a downturn, rents tend to do quite well. So if we're into more prolonged recession and we see the housing market dip in terms of sales, then I think that could be good news. That uncertainty often pushes people into rent or leads them to rent for longer, whilst they're waiting to see where values end up, if they were on the cusp of buying or now need to sell because of a change of circumstance but can still afford to rent. So I think there's real opportunities, and I think that as a sector we're well positioned, because actually we have an attractive proposition. And so for people who now find themselves needing to rent when they haven't perhaps in recent years, I think the idea of a professionally managed sector will be quite reassuring.
Yeah, I agree. I think, for us, some of the investors and operators that we're working with, it's very varied. There's sort of, maybe started to reduce rents at levels between sort of 5 and 10%. And some of that potentially public, with the kind of 2 weeks rent-free promotions, some of it less public with a more just kind of, okay, well, maybe we'll widen the margins of our qualification, criteria, and others I think are just really watching the market and sort of holding pricing and reviewing, options as they come along. I think one of the things that does have to be factored in, and we're certainly seeing, is this really compelling determination to ensure that existing tenants aren't marginalised. Build to rent, whether you've got a lot of tenants and it's really important that the new incoming tenants aren't seen to be benefiting from much lower prices than those that are already in situ, some of whom may well be struggling financially themselves. And renewals are clearly going to be just as much of a priority as securing new residents. So engendering that loyalty and trust now is kind of critical, isn't it? But it is definitely a challenge to kind of get that balance right. And I think, Steph, the point you made, and all of you really, that perhaps the difference might be felt differently in the types of model, the premium, highly amenitized, more expensive, schemes may well feel it more as people, choose to kind of be perhaps a bit more frugal, but, we'll see. It'll be another interesting one to watch. So that leads on nicely actually to the second point really, which is looking at investor priorities and whether those will change, and if so, how. So build to rent obviously is a long-term play. The long-term strategy ultimately is probably unlikely to change, but will there be a change in the short term? Do we think investors are going to sort of stick with that long-term approach and try and maintain rents, accept lower occupancy levels, or will they push for sort of faster absorption, higher occupancy levels, and accept the short-term hit in income and hope, fingers crossed, that the rental growth is sort of swift and sustained? So yeah, different views on that one if you've got them. So Tracey, I'll ask you first.
I suppose Howard de Walden has a slightly different take on this. I suppose if you need a definition of patient capital, it needs to be that the landed estates who definitely are in it for the very, very long haul, hundreds of years. And we have more than residential within the portfolio. So we would absolutely be looking to keep occupancy high. Not going to go bargain basement on the rents. I don't actually think we're going to need to. I don't think there is going to necessarily be that dichotomy between occupancy versus income, because I think that demand seems to be standing up quite well. But we understand that we live within a kind of a holistic system, and it's really important that we have those properties occupied, because the people occupying those homes are then the ones who are driving the footfall on the high street. And when the hospitality sector is able to open up, they will be the customers, and so on. So it's more than just looking at the rental income stream for us from residential. It's also the impact more generally within that community, of which we are the stewards, and take a very long-term view of that.
Matt, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, investors will probably want both. Why wouldn't they? That is an inevitable inevitable conclusion. But I think everybody that's in this game is accepts that it's a long-term investment model, and anybody that doesn't is in the wrong thing. And I think everybody will be closely following the next few months, and it also depends on where the individual schemes are. There'll be many schemes that are at a steady state occupancy, and I think in those kind of terms you won't feel the pinch as much. Renewals is obviously where it will be affected the most, but for those in lease up, I think there will need to be some conversations about how the strategy changes, or and whether or not we go with a more short-term view or a longer-term view. I think it depends entirely on the investor setup and the investor model, but I think they've got to think about it with a view to the medium to long term, and how that how that plays out.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you guys picked up on earlier about the need to sort of diversify portfolios. I think that's perhaps something that has left some exposed, and now they'll be sort of thinking very much about doing a risk assessment and kind of managing that, if they're exposed or kind of reliant on one demographic, whether that's international students or even a major employer, if they were local and the scheme was kind of full of that, and some of those obviously we've seen crash and burn. So it is interesting, the different sort of priorities that'll be there. Steph, you got a take on that from an investor perspective?
Of course. Now we may not necessarily have the hundreds of years view for each of our portfolios. However, we are in it for the long haul, and I think it will be a mix. As Matt said, you really have to look at the type of property that you're in. You also need to look at what stage of the life cycle it's in. All of our investors, in fact, we've been going through many client presentations lately. To some degree, they all expect an impact from this. We've run some quite robust risk analysis, because we do have some amazing team members who are far better with Excel and modeling than I am. And we do expect to see a mix between optimizing rents while balancing that occupancy, but also accepting probably a little bit slower of a trajectory on our lease up properties, because honestly, it's easier to regroup from a longer lease up than it is from dumping rents. And we have to be really careful that we don't dump rents and just put bodies in the properties, because you know, you did reference that some groups are saying, well, let's lower our standards. You know, do we really want to lower our standards? Because in the long run, and I've seen this over in the States as well, when people were only focusing on that, you know, that lovely 98% occupancy at any cost, we ended up at 70% economic occupancy, incredible arrears, evictions, which obviously is taking even more time out of the staff's day. It's also really creating havoc and detrimental impact on relationships with residents. If your residents see you evicting people all the time, what are they going to think? They're not going to feel secure in their homes. So, I mean, I think, you know, as I said, our teams, our investors, you know, we do expect the impact. It will be about making sure that our teams are thinking in a dynamic pricing type of mindset, really being as proactive as possible in this, especially because there likely will be a second wave. And, you know, we have to work with that. And also, as Matt said, on renewals, yes, so, you know, it's so important. Our residents who've been there paying market rents, you know, these premium rents, let's face it, you know, if all of a sudden you're offering 200 less on an apartment that's just like theirs and potentially even on an upper floor, you know, they're going to move, or they're going to demand that same price. And you know, I mean, been there, done that. It's not a fun conversation to have. And what we need to do is maintain that loyalty, as opposed to, you know, just kind of throwing money at them. This is where quality of teams, quality of service, and really thinking about the longer term business impact. And that's not just for the investment side. That's even in the leasing agents, the housekeepers on the site. Absolutely everybody needs to be on that same page together to build that value.
Yeah, it's interesting. The dynamic pricing thing, I think, is, you know, going to be critical, isn't it, going forwards? It'll allow investors to kind of stabilize, you know, cash flows in what's going to be a volatile market, and hopefully later on optimize the total building. And investors, you know, there are different strategies in play. Some, as you say, Tracey, yours is, you know, very, very long term, and we know, you know, Legal & General sort of have the, you know, really long term, and many of them do, and others maybe, you know, a shorter long term, but you know, less, it's the 5 to 10 years maybe. So it's different. There are different strategies in play, and you know, if the focus, for example, is on net operating income, then, you know, there's an ability to protect that income potentially if you can cut costs. So, you know, reducing the costs, which maybe operators have learned the ability to do in the last kind of 6 weeks, you know, work out where they can be leaner on costs going forwards. And then, you know, maybe that allows a little bit of room in other areas. So it's, yeah, it's going to be, it'll be interesting to see the differences and you know, how it changes and how it affects the market. So moving on to consumer behaviour. Roger's just thrown a question in about reintegration of furloughed staff. We're going to talk a bit about operations just towards the end, so I will get to your question, Roger, but I'm just going to move on to consumer behaviour now, if that's okay. And just sort of get your view really on how you expect that to change, both short and long term. I think, you know, certainly in terms of demand, we were talking about this before we started, that, you know, our lockdown measures have lifted rather unexpectedly quickly this week, but we've already seen at Homemade definitely an influx of, you know, applicants wanting to do physical viewings. So there is a confidence in the market to start doing that. But alongside that, and, you know, definitely we saw it throughout lockdown, and it's continuing, that there is still a very strong demand for the video viewings alongside, you know, the physical ones. And we've seen people, you know, very happy to sign long-term contracts on the back of a video viewing and you know, do some contactless move-in. So any initial spike, I guess, is likely to be coming from those with this immediate need to move, either because the end of a current tenancy, which has happened now, or during lockdown, or obviously any urgent need for more affordable accommodation. So there's definitely an opportunity, you know, here and now for the most reactive operators to capitalise on. But looking wider than that, there sort of seems to be an acceptance that there'll be a shifting in priorities. Affordability, we know, is always key, and now more so than ever. Those with, you know, little or no income or savings, or other, spending a significant percentage of their income on rent, they're going to be feeling very exposed. You know, just like we talked about investors. So they're, they're going to choose to reduce their outgoings and maybe build up savings so they've got a buffer. So working from home, we know everybody's doing that. May be something people continue to want to do. Outside space more of a priority. So what other factors, should operators kind of consider now to ensure that they can capitalise on the market demand that's going to be there, that we're all super confident is there? I'll come to you, Matt, on that one first.
Yeah, look, I think first of all, any kind of financial uncertainty is going to cause people to kind of have a good long look at their own circumstances and kind of reevaluate what their outgoings are to kind of protect themselves. And we know for many renters, particularly in London, rent is 50% essentially of their net income, and so I think it's inevitable that for those that are significantly exposed, that they start to look at other alternatives. I think for those in the younger generations, that may mean looking to to sort of move back in with parents, or potentially look at sharing, where generally they tend to save a bit of money. Potentially also looking at moving outside of the central London zones 1 and 2, perhaps. We'll also see a sort of trend just to find sort of cheaper alternatives. But I also think that with everything that's happened so far over the last sort of 7 weeks, the market has paused, but it's paused, and a lot of consumers will be sort of sat at home, or have been sat at home, spending very little. If you think about sort of the young professional market, particularly, the pubs have been shut, so the Friday night beer after work, or the Friday night beers after work haven't happened. So a lot of consumers will have found their spending has significantly decreased, which has meant actually there's not saying there's an unlimited pot of cash, but people might have just a little bit more money to be able to go out and make spending decisions that are slightly different to the ones they would have done. I think in terms of what customers will want, look, I think that the whole concept of working from home is one that in the property industry we've kind of been really slow to adapt to, in my opinion. I think customers now will want more from their home. It's not just going to be a bed and a place to sleep when they get in from work at 9 o'clock at night. It's very much now going to be about how can you live your life, but within your home. So things like outdoor space, whether it be communal spaces or balconies, or what we have at East Village, winter gardens, which can be used kind of throughout the year. Those kind of things are going to be really, really key now. Actually, little things like having a stable internet connection. It's something that perhaps in a previous life we took for granted, but for those of you that are spending your life on Zoom or any of the other video chat services, and you've had issues with internet connectivity, you understand now how important that's going to be moving forward. So I think that whole concept of being able to kind of self-service, but without having to travel miles and miles to use a printer, or to go to the shops, or to go for a bite to eat, I think is going to be really key. So having that kind of diverse mix of residential and retail, but also in terms of the retail, having alternatives for people, something that at Get Living we've done really well, particularly at East Village with our retail presence there. So I think that's going to be so important. I also think things like safety, security, flexibility are also going to be key. I think with any financial uncertainty, people need to feel confident that should they find themselves in difficult times, that they're going to be supported through that. And again, to echo what I said earlier, that's where as operators we've got a real opportunity to to set ourselves apart and lead the charge in this, and to show that we really care about these people. you know, so something that Get Living do, for example, we offer flexible tenancies. I think that's going to be key. I know that with the market confidence returning, that people probably will start to think about, you know, feel more secure around sort of committing to longer term. But I think it will be at the back of people's minds, you know, particularly if there is a second wave and we go back into a lockdown or a partial lockdown that you know, if they lose their job, what protection are they going to have? I think is going to also be really important.
Yeah, I think they're all really, really valid points. Thanks. Steph, what's your view?
I mean, I have to echo some of what Matt said. I mean, not to, you know, it's great and also scary when we're all kind of birds of a feather, I think. But I do think, you know, safety, security is paramount. You know, more residents asking about that, probably more than ever. Also, one of the things too is something as simple as cleanliness on the properties. You know, they're really conscious of it. One of our sites, you know, has actually had multiple residents send in emails to the property manager just to compliment and say, I always see the housekeeper. Thank you so much. You know, like they're always steaming and cleaning and sanitizing the buttons. And obviously we're doing this to also, not just for our residents, because obviously we want to take care of our residents, but we're also doing it to maintain the integrity of the property, to make sure that we're not getting any infections on the site. You know, but it's a win-win situation. And actually, I mentioned earlier that Kingsley Grace Hill survey and WebEx that they did, one of the top priorities that residents were communicating about were specifically about the two-way communication with the office staff and the concerns they had around that. And then also the cleanliness / safety aspects of it. So not just, you know, oh, are the doors locking, but also what are we also doing to be responsible about that in our buildings? You know, and Joe, as you mentioned, there's been a really huge acceptance of virtual tours. And I think that to flash back about 7 years ago when I first arrived here, I remember people looking at me like I was daft when I was talking about how we used to show people on WhatsApp and you know, that we used to do these virtual tours and we had videos loaded onto our websites and stuff like that. And they were like, oh, the English population will never want to do that. Well, we're seeing that actually it wasn't the clients, it wasn't the consumer base that was afraid of adopting that. It was actually us. I think we were afraid of making ourselves irrelevant, but we're never going to do that. There's still that human need for interaction, and there will still be questions that no video tour on the planet will ever answer. You know, so it's really great to see that as well. And I think that will also help make things a bit more efficient for the on-site teams. You know, and it's going to be about that true engagement. I do think that what we're seeing is that there's also been a huge acceptance of some of the online programs and things like that we've put in place out of necessity, because obviously, you know, you can't exactly have everybody down for a big party or barbecue on a rooftop terrace right now. You know, where people are actually really enjoying, whether it's charades and bingo on Zoom, or whether it's, you know, waking up in the morning, you know, rolling into the living room and doing a bit of yoga, or I loved that one of our student housing sites, one of the team members is an amazing artist. This woman can do anything. And so she started giving art classes to the residents. And I think that there will be a bit of a shift, because there's been such a positive reaction to that it's going to be a really healthy mix between, you know, kind of those expensive gala style events that we do on the site, but then also doing things that are pretty cost effective, really, which will also help to streamline costs and help buffer against potentially some of those rent, you know, the rent reductions that we may need to put in place here and there.
Yeah. I think they're all, you know, super valid. I think, you know, the cleaning bit, I think critical. I think, you know, maybe from an operations perspective, it used to be done in the twilight hours, you know, get the building clean when people can't see. Now people want to see that it's being cleaned, you know, they really want it to be done so that they can see it. They're really grateful for that. You know, it's really interesting, that point about, you know, actually starting to get your residents to run the engagement programs, and maybe sometimes they're happy to do that virtually, even if they could do it, you know, communally. So, you know, yeah, there's definitely a change, you know, and lots of things that can be capitalized on. Tracey, do you want to pick anything up on that thread?
I would add that I think there's probably a renewed appreciation of doing the basics well, being that approachable, responsive landlord, being open to communications, and being pragmatic and sensible when people's circumstances change, looking after people and the buildings, and so all that stuff around cleaning and that, which we all kind of did, but actually it's interesting now that that has come to the forefront. I think the kind of broadband 5G type connectivity is going to be really key going forward. And interestingly, one of the trends that we have picked up on already is a number of people who are currently sharers are really, really keen to no longer share. And not just with their current sharers, but they've just, I think that probably experience of being in lockdown for a number of weeks and with the potential for future lockdowns has made some people reassess and think they'd rather stretch the budget and maybe try and get a studio or a one bed on their own. And you can just imagine that the pressure for space, if you're trying to work from home and your flatmate wants to do a Zoom gym class, for example, I mean, it must have led to all sorts of tensions and trying to coordinate times to cook in the kitchen. These really basic things that when you're confined to your flat as opposed to the whole kind of development, so that's certainly an early trend we've picked up on, is actually a sort of shift away from sharing, but how long-lived that is, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely that classic breakup of friends, and yeah, that's it is. You will have learned things about your property that you never really expected to learn, and it changes priorities all over. And I think obviously it's going to be key now how those messages are communicated. So making sure that the messaging really reflects that kind of psyche. That you can reach those prospective residents directly, especially as probably now more than ever. I mean, we've already seen some big shifts in people's willingness to relocate to completely different parts of London, and I think now more than ever they're going to be open to that. I heard anecdotally just on the radio of someone who had to move outside of their property. I think they were having stuff done and then ended up getting stuck there, and theirs was a central London property, and now they've got no desire to move back into it because they don't want to go back into that central location. They've discovered they want a garden and all the things we've talked about. So I think it's going to be really key to make sure that you can capitalize on that, and that you can start to to make sure that your property, your schemes are reaching a really wide market, and obviously that you can kind of engage with them where they are across all these crazy multiple digital channels they're now on. So yeah, I think that's all really valid. So yeah, just kind of bringing it, I suppose, to the last point really, and it's trying to pull together everything we've already talked about. So it is developing this sort of winning strategy. I think it's clear from everything that we've talked about that there are multiple factors that are going to come into play. The market's definitely going to be competitive, and marketing strategies clearly, as always, are going to be key. The best ones here are going to be really highly proactive and not just reactive. So I think we've talked about costs and the need for those to sort of be kept to a minimum. Certainly if from the investor perspective, it's now going to be more important than ever to understand what the fully loaded cost to acquire a customer is. I think that's going to be something that people are going to start paying a lot more attention to. I think, as I say, that's going to be paramount, and in the face of what we've agreed are likely to be falling rents, even if, that's kind of only in the short term, being able to really closely track spend across everything, and marketing spend and what the return on investment will be are going to be critical. So I think there's a lot of things that are going to change, and we certainly believe that the days where sort of large landlords have to rely on traditional letting agents charging 7, 8, 10% are kind of over, and owners and operators are now really looking for ways that they can bring that fully loaded cost down to 3 to 4% or lower, whilst maintaining real quality and brand consistency. So we've talked about how important it is to relook at your scheme through the eyes of the new renter with all of those drivers, and making sure obviously that messaging reflects what renters will now place as that sort of priority. And I think Dave talked yesterday at the end of the Get Living webinar about how sort of one of the defining legacies of COVID will be the adoption of new technologies. which, you know, I think we all agree have been driven through sort of necessity initially, but will now be something that is part of everyday life. So I think that's wholly accurate, and I think it represents a step change that, you know, can be seen and continue to be utilised in areas across the sector. And Steph, you've talked about that and tech and how, you know, it'll play its part. So what other factors do you see needing to be addressed as part of the winning strategy? I think for me, it kind of sits in marketing, which, you know, I've looked at there. I think, you know, there's going to be operational challenges, and we can bring Roger's question in here about sort of bringing back furloughed staff, but also the resident communication piece. So it's just drawing together the kind of, you know, themes that we've talked about and sort of how we see those being pulled together and how you might address them in sort of creating your strategy going forwards.
Yeah, and I think first and foremost, it is, you know, an important lesson that we can take from COVID is that we've actually progressed our market by about 5 years compared to where the North American market, you know, took a little bit longer to adopt technology. We have done it. It has been out of necessity. We've seen some really great products coming forward, as I mentioned, and then some of those that maybe weren't completely optimal, those companies, it's more important than ever now for us to work with them to help shape that product even more. You know, I think talking about marketing, we do need to be very conscious. I'm a bit terrified to even think about the fact that people weren't thinking about the cost of actually getting a lead or a lease. You know, and hopefully everybody was. I imagine that they were to a degree, but you know, it's all about the quality of it and making sure that we're really tracking that. What is an effective source for us? You know, is it cost effective? You know, you can throw money at these leads all day long, but if your on-site staff and your teams, whether you're working with agents, whether you have it handled in-house for leasing, if they're not handling those leads appropriately, you're throwing money out. You may as well just go and dump it down into the sewer. You know, I mean, biggest thing is making sure, I think this is the most vital, that your teams are trained. They need to know how to build rapport, especially whether it's on the phone, whether it's on the, whether it's on a virtual tour, whatever the case may be. And ultimately, they also have to follow up. That is typically, even more so on the qualification portion, I see it even more on the follow-up, where nobody ever gets back in touch with somebody. And that's really a very troubling thought, because it's that person who follows up and shows that they care that that person walked in the door and they knew that that person loved it. Maybe they weren't ready to make that decision, especially right now where there will be a tendency to maybe shop around a little bit more. You know, it's going to be that service level that pushes it above. So right now, you know, I mean, I'm very lucky. I love my site teams. They're actually really quite awesome. I think that, you know, we can never have too much training for our staff, and not just on the leasing aspect, but also cross training, because you want to have efficiencies. You know, if your property manager is off for a week, you want your assistant manager or your leasing agent to be able to step in and help and have that bit of accountability where they can take that ownership of that situation and take care of something. And also that they recognize that they are building a career path. We have to retain our quality employees. We have to. You know, if otherwise it just becomes a salary war and people will start bouncing around, just like they did in the lettings game, you know, to 20 different property management firms within 5 years. And that's not, okay, maybe not 20, but it's not conducive to actually furthering our prospects. And, you know, I mean, I think that giving the resident voices via tech, via surveys, I mean, obviously we have to have that one-to-one conversation as well, but giving that ability to give somebody maybe a slightly anonymous voice if they want to, about concerns that they have, whether that's via Kingsley, whether that's via something that's in-house. I know that we adopted Kingsley on some of our sites and are now rolling those out across our entire portfolio. And we're even going to be stretching that into mainland Europe as well. Really excited about that because, you know, it travels through the life cycle of that resident's stay, of their first engagement all the way through, even after they move out. And I think that's really important because we have to see where we can do better. And we have to be open to actually analyzing that and using that information. So again, useful technology, and making sure that there's the follow-up action behind it. You know, and we also have, oh, sorry, Joe, I was just going to mention too, if somebody doesn't have a portal, please get one. Your residents have to have portals to reach you. I mean, it can't all be via email. As we know, emails, they rack up every day. So, just little things like that, or even having Zoom or WhatsApp where maintenance tech can help triage for a resident because their water's, there's water leaking out of the bottom of their sink. These little things that we've implemented during COVID-19, we have to keep looking at how we can improve those as we move on.
Yeah, no, I think it's really, fascinating that you're saying it's moved you forward by 5 years. I mean, that these can only be positive outcomes of what, most definitely hasn't been a positive event. But Tracey, I know training is close to your heart, and something that you run through with the Howard de Walden guys, and so I'm sure that you'd echo those sentiments. I'm conscious that we're sort of running out of time. I do want to just address the question, probably, I don't know, maybe to you, Steph, but Roger's asked just about, are you planning on reintegrating any furloughed staff? And do you think you may have an us and them from those who have sort of, been through the challenges of working through the crisis? Do you think that might happen? Matt, maybe Matt. Sorry, Steph.
Oh, you're fine.
Yeah, I mean, we've been incredibly fortunate that we've not had to use the government's furlough scheme at Get Living, but I think it's a really valid point, and I suppose from my perspective, if I was starting to think about reintegration, it would be wanting to make sure that those employees who have been placed on the furlough scheme, feel absolutely as valued as everybody else, and I think it's about making sure that they know, because psychologically it will cast doubt in people's minds, and I think it's just about making sure that they know that it's not because of them as individuals or their performance. It's just because of the economic or operational needs to support the business, to make sure that when we get through this, which we will do, that there's a company and an employer there for them at the end of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I know you guys, did a lot with care packages and all sorts as well, didn't you? So, been looking after them. But
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I think probably sort of wrap up. I mean, the overarching takeaway for me is that, there's a huge amount of positive to come. I think, there's no doubt that although unexpectedly, and I think categorically not the way anybody would have perhaps wanted it to happen, but the kind of combining of all of the events that are taking place, it could very, very well be a build to rent coming of age, so to speak. So yeah, I thank you all for your time. I hope it was interesting to sort of hear those different perspectives. I know it was for me. And Dave, do you want to just wrap up?
Thank you, Joe. I just start off by saying thank you, to Tracey, Matt, and Stephanie for some really interesting views on the future. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Some familiar names, some new names. What we want to do is continue the dialogue with you. Joe is absolutely right. I think the prospects for build to rent as an investment class, as a proposition for consumers, and a solution to some of the way we're going to get society working again, is absolutely bright. But we have to talk about it. We have to find the right ways of doing that. And you who are watching this webinar are absolutely crucial to that as well. So what I'd really like to ask you is, tell me how you want the UKAA to work with you on that. What are the things we can do? What are the things that you can do? And we'll respond to that. We see it as a huge opportunity as well. And also part of that is, what do we do over the next few weeks as people go back to work and actually, start to go, well, actually, I don't have all day to spend on Zoom calls. I've got a real job to do. So please tell us how you'd like to interact with us, but tell us also what topics you want us to talk about and how to do that. For the moment, though, we're actually got an interesting, we're taking a break from webinars for 24 hours at least. The next one is on, our next one is on Tuesday, when Educated Body are talking about the future for gyms and pools post-COVID-19, which should be a very interesting webinar, I think. But again, so just thank you. Remind you once again, this webinar will be available as a recording in a few days on the UKAA website, on the events page. I can just really say thanks again to all the panelists. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the sunshine and stay safe. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you. Bye.